Hello, welcome back to part 5 in our How It's Made videos. And last video was about a week ago, so we had a little bit of time go by. But due to the time period there, we did have a couple questions on distal taper. So we ended last video with the rough grind on our Type 15. And then we went from, we were talking about, starting the next phase, which is our distal taper. So we're going to be doing that before the next video, but I want to focus here and just really talk about what distal taper is and why we do it and why it's vital for historical pieces. So for every blade, the geometry of the blade overall has to be taken into the context in which it was used. So this particular blade, Type 15, existed at the height of the medieval time period. So this existed alongside of plate armor. And the way it was used, to make it very simple, it was a massive spike of a sword that they would use to jam into the joints of the armor to try to puncture chainmail. So for this particular type of blade, you don't want to use, so the distal taper, and I mentioned this earlier, distal taper is tapering in the thickness of the blade. So you don't want your distal taper to get too thin on a Type 15 because you need a very rigid blade for how this blade was used. You still want to distal taper it a bit to remove a lot of weight out and to bring the balance point where you want it. But you don't want to make it overly thin so that when you use this as a stiff spike, it ends up being crazy flexible all over the place. So with that, with that knowledge in mind, when you look at historical examples, Type 15s, because of their massive profile taper, their distal taper is not as much as some other blades might be. So this is true for a lot of blades. So if we go the other way, so if we go a couple centuries earlier, and I think I showed this blade a couple videos ago, but so this particular blade has an entirely different distal taper than a Type 15, an entirely different thickness profile. So these blades were used against chainmail armor and cloth armor and leather armor, and they weren't. The context of these blades is they're not used as jabbing spikes, right? They're used as big, wide cutting blades. So they want to be wide to shear through objects. So because of that, these particular blades are thin throughout their whole geometry. So you won't see much distal taper, but they're light because they're so thin overall. So if you pick up a Viking blade and it's super thick, that may not be accurate depending on what they're trying to do, but for the most part, Viking blades are not thick. I think the average thickness on a Viking blade is 150-ish, I think, maybe a little less. So Viking blades were quite thin, quite flexible, and then used for chopping. So context is very important, and the overall geometry of your blade is quite important when you're developing historical pieces. And that's our goal, is to give you something that's quite historical, based on pieces that we got a chance to measure, and can feel and function the way the originals were. So we have one other example. So this one existed going back to the time period that we prefer, which is the High Medieval. So this is also against plate armor, but obviously due to the width of this blade, this is kind of designed to be both a blade that you can thrust in with as a big stabbing spike, as well as a good cutting blade. So the distal taper on this is quite important. Again, you don't want it to be too thin that it gets too flexible, but at the same time you don't want it too thick that it's not a good cutter. So the distal taper on these sometimes is not linear. Sometimes it'll take a drastic distal taper in the first third of the blade and then very little in the last 2/3. Depends on where the optimal cutting point is and how you want to thrust and cut with this blade. So distal taper is quite complex. And knowing the individual blade styles and how they are used and the context in which they are used is vital to getting that geometry of the blade right. So yeah, I hope that describes distal taper a little bit better. Basically, again, it's how the geometry of the thickness changes throughout its length. It's very important for historical blades. The best way to gain the knowledge on this is to study as many original pieces as you can of various sword types. So hope that helps describe distal taper a little bit better. And next video we're going to pick up, we're going to continue on with our Type 15. And thank you very much.